and I'm really delighted to kick off our 3-day HR Heroes event with this session. I hope you all enjoy it. So just to introduce myself and my colleague on the call, Rubani, who you can see in the picture, will be our technical producer today. So if you have any problems at all with the login or the Q&A, the chat function, please put something in the chat to Rubani, who will be there to help. Today, I'm your host. I'm Deb Tier, and I'm Client Director here at LHH. I've been here for 7 years, but before that, I worked in HR for 11 years, and this is a topic quite close to my heart. When I was in HR, I mainly focused on elements of HR business partnering, a change and transformation, restructuring, and that kind of thing. Now that I'm in working from LHH's point of view, I get to work with all kinds of different size industries, different types of industries, working on leadership development support. So I have a much broader overview of everything now. Today, as you know, the topic is HR losing its human touch? And what we'll be doing is going over these 3 key areas as an introduction to the topic. These are mainly my personal thoughts on the topic of my experience and what I thought about when I worked in HR. So they are my own experiences, and I would say that please do put comments in the chat function as we go, or please ask questions as we go, and Rubani will pick them up. At the end of the session, there will be a Q&A, and I will try and answer as many questions as possible that come through. So let's get on. We're going to start with a quick poll because it's really useful to see the size of your organisations. I'm really conscious that when I was in HR, I worked in a couple of smaller organisations, a couple of 100 people, where I was either working on my own or with one other person. But I've also worked in a team of 60 HR people in a company of 10,000 people, and HR there feels very different. So let's start with a look at HR practices through the ages. Now, I could go further back, but I've chosen to stick with the 1980s. It was a great decade, but also it was a really important decade for HR. And the main reason was the term human resources was first coined and started to be commonly used in the 1980s. When it was formed, the person who decided that the human term and the resources term was meant in a really positive way. It was meant that the human part was realised to be that people are so important to an organisation, and the resource part was that they were to be really valued and looked after, and that's how human resources came to be. Now, of course, human resources has had a bit of a bad rep as we go on into the future, which hasn't necessarily always been fair, but I think we'd all agree on the call that HR has been on a journey itself throughout the ages, as we'll see. I do want to caveat as well that I've missed huge parts of history, and do forgive me because we only have limited time on the call, so I've chosen just a few salient points to get us through. So then we move on to the 1990s, and this was really important for HR because this was the first term used of strategic human resource management. And this was really important because, firstly, HR was really aligning people and resources to the goals of the organisation. Anyone that's done any kind of studying of HR practice will know the term or the name Dave Ulrich. And in 1997, his seminal piece of work on business partnering that was released identified the 3-legged stool, which most people in HR would know today. And that is the business partnering side of the business, the shared services part of the business, and the centres of excellence. Now, at the time that was released, Dave Ulrich had said that it was meant to be a thought leadership piece and maybe not copied directly, and that each organisation and in their each context had to think about how that might work for them. And that's why he did a couple of updates 10, 15 years later about how that could evolve. Lots of companies, though, went straight to that model and copied that model. And I think there were a lot of learnings from different organisations as we went through. Now, personally, when I first went through a period of centralising HR, I don't know if any of you have also been through that or remember the first time of doing that. I remember feeling quite disconnected from the employees that I was then trying to serve. The whole idea that they had to go to a central team and then be allocated someone out. I remember people in the organisation or managers saying, but Deb, can't we just come to you? It'd be much easier if we could just come to you first. And of course, being a service person, I said, yeah, just come to me, which probably actually undermined the whole process that we were trying to do. But I think it's a really hard transition when you're used to helping people to go into that kind of model. Now we move on to the 2000s. And again, those of you working in this time will probably remember a real pivotal piece of research which came from McKinsey, and that was called the War for Talent. And it was around this time that the first term was used of EVP, Employee Value Proposition. And so this was the time that employees were really being thought about as what were their needs. HR were really thinking that talent is scarce, that we need to be able to meet their needs. Why are all these people walking out? What do we need to do in order to keep people? And so there's a lot more focus then with this strategic HRM which had come through about the focus on behaviours, what made people tick, what are the levers that we could pull, what could we give in order to get back from employees. Then we move on to the 2010s. Those of you again that will know that in that era we had a huge influx of HR technology that came to the fore. So those that have worked pre-2010 in some organisations, and I get that this again will feel very different depending on the size of your organisation and the progressiveness of your organisation, as some of you may have had this before. But if you're in a smaller organisation and we used to having your employee names and data on spreadsheets, then it was always really hard to be able to get employee metrics out to the business. But in 2010, when we had much more HR technology that joined, we were able to give that kind of data that wanted HR people to have a seat at the table. This was when this first started to happen, because there suddenly was the data to be able to start competing with the likes of other functions like finance, like marketing, who are much more easily able to kind of prove their worth through metrics and tackle side by side what HR was doing versus other functions. So it was a really important era. Also in 2010, lots of you will remember the e-filing projects that we had to do. So gone were the days we had those huge filing cabinets and had to search through lots and lots of paper files, reams of paper everywhere in HR all the time. When it went to electronic storage, it also helped HR be able to be a lot more accessible to the business. So rather than be put away in a corner because of confidentiality or because of all the files, I think that really freed HR up in some ways to be able to be much more accessible to the business. And lastly, the 2020s, so the current decade. We all know that that started with the pandemic. That totally shifted the world of work as we know it today. So huge transition for HR. HR at the helm of all of the changes and really spearheading that. So I think gained a lot of traction and that look at strategic resources and how do we help employees and how do we make sure that the companies are able to work, which was really good. But now we've got this situation where it will never be the same again. There are some elements like hybrid working and globalization and all these other factors that will always look to change the world of work. And now HR have to, in the strategic space that we've now got, really think about how do we pull all of that together for the good of the employees and for the organizations together. And there's always that tension, I feel, that when people join HR, I think for the majority of HR people, you're joining because you really want to make things good for people. And so that tension between the business objectives and trying to do the best for employees is always there. And so the title of the seminar is HR Losing Its Human Touch. And these were a few of the areas in my personal experience working in HR that I really felt slightly more disconnected. Now, I'd love to hear from you. You may well agree with some of these as I talk through this slide. Please feel free to put in the chat whether you think that these resonate for you, or whether you think there were other factors as well that you might have experienced that maybe I've missed that we can pick up at the end of this section. So indicators that HR might have lost its human touch. So centralisation, I talked about Dave Ulrich's work then, and certainly my study about when you're separated, HR sometimes in organisations, and again, larger organisations, maybe having to raise a ticket in order to get support, you know, that can feel a bit disjointed. It can make things slower. Obviously, the point of centralisation was to make use of efficiencies, people doing similar jobs all the time, so making less mistakes. Obviously, that cost element that comes there. But with that centralisation, there could be a lack of local knowledge. Certainly, that disconnect from managers, if it's farmed out to any particular HR business partner in some models where you don't have some people looking after particular regions, and it just goes to who's the most free, then there can feel a disconnect there. Increased use of HR, tech and AI. I don't know how many of you might have AI chatbots, certainly in HR. How do people get helped to look for information on your HR website? Certainly we had the move to HR services, so employees were doing things for themselves, and we needed them to, didn't we? Because what we really needed was for HR to have the freed up time to be able to do all of these more strategic projects and strategic thinking. But I think with that HR technology came that disassociation, disconnection, sometimes from employees. Perceived lack of empathy. I think at times, again, it depends on the process that you're managing here. It certainly depends on the culture of the organisation, and sometimes even between the HR person and the employee themselves. But this perceived lack of empathy. And what we mean here is that carrying out an HR policy rigidly to the policy rather than having any flex about the context or the situation. And so I think at times, again, there could be a reputational point of view that sometimes HR were just trying to serve the business rather than actually trying to help the employee. Disconnected from employees, I mean something else by this, and I think this is come to light because of centralisation and because of HR technology. I was speaking to my brother-in-law last week and telling him about the webinar that I was just about to do. And he said, I had 2 interactions with HR when he just left his job. One was on day 1 and one was on the last day for the exit interview. And he said, and other than that, I didn't have any interaction whatsoever. And when it got me thinking about that and doing this webinar, I was thinking, is it a double standard? Is it a double standard to expect HR to have more human touch than any other colleague in any other department? Surely we would expect the respect from other colleagues and that humanity from anyone and not just from HR. So that got me thinking around, you know, this disconnection. Really, HR are supporting the line managers more. I think that many teams, certainly individual contributors teams, don't feel they need a connection with HR, and certainly in larger organisations where, again, HR might be much more separate. In smaller organisations, I get when I worked in HR for a small company, you are much more visible, much more there day to day. And so that connection with employees can be a lot greater than sometimes when you're at that larger organisation and those 2 or 3 steps away. And the final point here, this over-reliance on metrics. So because HR technology really enabled HR to finally deliver some of the metrics that businesses needed, that maybe at times, if it can't be measured, it doesn't get solved. And that sometimes can be, we do all of these things about employee engagement, so we have measurements and things like that, but how much maybe are we lacking that qualitative element, that talking point to employees to be able to make sure that they feel they have that human touch. So those were a few of my points. Rabani, I was just going to hand over to you to see if we have any comments about those sections, what people feel.
It seems quite mixed. There is some on centralization, and I think most of them are on AI, where they believe AI is kind of responsible for losing the human touch.
Yeah, no, okay. And that's absolutely fine. I think reading a couple of these out, we've got my former employer has centralized, whereas when I was there, we were split into BP teams for each unit. My wife happens to still work there, and her colleagues often mention how they miss the old HR. And I think that definitely is something that I feel, and again, in larger organizations where you have a very distinct split between them. I have a comment. The impact on the economy has resulted in staff reduction. However, the workload is still there, resulting in less time to fill and more focus on the get it done. Yeah, I agree with that. I think, again, in the old days, I think there was a particular ratio, wasn't there, of how many HR people there should be for each number of group of employees. And I think with HR technology and the efficiencies, that scale got changed. And so it just felt that if you're never seen an HR person, what if you start an organization, you don't have an interaction with HR, you're not getting on with your manager or your team or someone, who do you go to? We know that people know to go to HR, but just to have that face and that connection time where they really know that person and can reach out can really help. We've got a comment. We're building an AI assistant that looks at all the information companies have about policies, support, training, etc., to use that to present content to the visitor. Early days, but exciting. Look, I'm going to touch on AI in the next section, certainly, because I do think AI could be really beneficial for HR as we move forward. We've got a comment there. That is a sad state of affairs. An organisation is a collection of people. Managers run teams, which I presume is people. However, when it comes to anything people, they look at HR, they look within. And look, and this is what I mean about the double standard. I certainly feel that, you know, do we really need to have a human touch? What does human touch mean? What it means to me versus you? Is that actually that physical presence? I think sometimes it can be. Is it just that employees want to be known for being thought about, you know, that they come first in policy making or changes rather than just the business? So the business needs to do this. Are we actually really thinking about employees in that way? I've got another one here. The raise a ticket comment resonates with me. Luckily, I hadn't been in an area where you had to raise tickets to deal with HR, but I can feel that feels disconnected, doesn't it? Wait in line, take a ticket, and I'll come back to you. In a large firm where my wife works, it's almost impossible to know who her HR business partner is. She can't go beyond the ticketing system, and it's a faceless response. And I think it's a really sad state of affairs, isn't it, when we get to that kind of section and look at that. And then we've got some other comments, and thank you very much for putting them all through. We'll touch on some more of them in a bit, and I'll move on to this next section, which hopefully will also resonate some comments. But thank you very much for all of them so far. So, strategies to reintroduce human touch back into HR. I know I've come out with a couple of provocative statements about, you know, is it HR's role, etc. And there's an assumption that if you're a people person and you go into HR, then you want to help people. And I really believe that we do. And I do think there needs to be a marriage between the AI and tech, which is going to help HR, and the people function or how we help people. I think someone in the chat there said around, are we there to help managers? I think that's true. I think, you know, when I worked in HR, there was a lot of hand holding. So it was HR always had to be there because you're a bit worried that the manager wasn't able to do it themselves or competent or say the wrong thing. And so HR was always present. But actually, when you think about it, you know, it always was their role. They're the manager, they recruited the person. What HR does in the background is create that ecosystem and policies and culture around being able to help managers do their jobs. So when we look at the strategies to reintroduce human touch, what I wanted to share with you was the 6 key topics that LHH receives requests for in order to help organisations, because I thought that might help you guys, us being kind of leadership and HR organisation. Knowing these topics may well help you think about, right, where do I want to focus myself and my energies in the future or develop. And the other thing I wanted to say is I did a very quick poll of my team to say, how much work do we receive or requests do we receive for services around supporting HR teams in order to do work? And it's really minimal. I mean, the largest amount we have is helping a group of employees, mainly for succession. So they would be leaders in post or senior leaders, sometimes for individual teams, but hardly ever for HR. And I felt that certainly when I worked in HR, we never had that investment, given that HR has this really unique bird's eye view of the whole of the organisation, that interplay between teams, how teams fit together, an organisational design, but we don't have some of these foundational skills or investment in order to be able to do that. So I'm going to touch on a few of these and just give some explanation and context, and then we'll move on. So being a change agent, you guys all know we've been through constant change, not just because of the pandemic, which obviously changed things forever, but people are worried about change. Employees generally are worried about the state of change, not just all the change we've had, but lots of change in the world and life, and certainly with technology, and they need help navigating that. And with everything that we're now asking line managers to do, I really feel that HR, this has been on the agenda for ages, but HR could be real change champions here. But how many people in HR actually get that support to really understand change, the levers for change, and how to influence, let's say if we're saying HR is really supporting line managers and managers to do that type of the role for organisations and people. I don't think we have enough in that. So maybe that's something that, you know, organisations can think about to really help HR help everyone else in the future. Organisational culture champion. Now, this has to start somewhere. We want a culture. People want a good culture to be part of. If we let individual teams do that and we didn't have a centralised function for culture, you would have many micro cultures. I'm sure lots of people would think that in their organisation they have that anyway within departments, but there does need to be someone who's spearheading that human psychology around how do we have everyone pulling together on the same values, that same red thread through an organisation, that we understand where we come from, what we represent, and what our purpose is. So again, that's a kind of element with having that training, really helping line managers to be able to have that conversations with their employees about that. Human-centric leadership. This is around, again, HR really understanding human psychology and psychology of the world today. So what we know from LHH research is that people and leaders that have a much stronger emphasis on human-centered leadership or human-centric leadership will come out highest on top. They will have more people that want to align to them, that will follow their vision. They will have employees that feel happier and that are more productive. But if HR aren't able to do that challenging or really understanding some of that feedback that either comes through employee surveys and how that they can coach particular line managers in what they need, then how does that work? And that leads neatly into coaching skills. So again, given that business partnering was meant to be one of these pillars, coaching is an absolute fundamental skill, whether HR needs it for with employees, with doing grievances or disciplinaries or any other kind of topic, but also particularly for coaching line managers. The other area I think the coaching skills really comes into its own is we're in this unprecedented era of, you know, gig economy, freelancing. This links into organizational culture, but also coaching for reskilling, because there will be a reskilling crisis. People are going to be thinking about AI, tech, what do I do? How do I move forward? What's my next role? And I think HR can have a leading role in this in an organization, but they need to have the skills to be able to really understand where roles are. Now, we have HR technology that's going to help that. There are a lot of different technologies now that can map skill competencies against other ones so that people can really see what they might be able to do in an organisation. But fundamentally, I think HR could have a real positive influence in that space. Team cohesion is another one. It's a big topic for LHH, and we had a piece of research that was validated by the CRF last year. And teams now, when you think about how disconnected we are from how digital we are, how disconnected because we're always on our phones and not really seeing people in person anymore, actually team cohesion can be really important. The CRF research showed that 69% of managers are members of 5 or more teams. So the amount of teams, certainly as we work in this matrix organisation, is only getting higher and higher. So again, I think HR could play a real lead role. But this means understanding team dynamics. It means really being able to understand how teams work together. Sometimes it can be about 2 separate teams coming together and those ways of working and how that they can get the best out of each other. And this is an area that certainly LHH is seeing a big increase in at the moment, because I think people are realizing that when you work together, when you personally know people, you can be so much more productive. And certainly at LHH, in the area that I work in, when we meet together in person for a day every other month, half of the whole day is spent on social connection. And that doesn't mean talking about work or something that you need to do. It means just getting to know a different colleague on a more personal level, because what that's going to do is really help people to be able to get on and be more productive and resolve those conflicts more easily. And this last area that I want to talk about now is technological proficiency. So we're in an age, as we well know, an AI age, and I think that because AI could really help HR people in the future, it's going to take a lot of those real mundane tasks away from us, really free people up to do that more strategic thinking. If HR could be forerunners in this, really get on board with the AI, really get the handle on it, because lots of employees are scared. They're scared about it coming and taking their jobs. They don't know how much of that is going to help their job or enhance their job. And I think if HR could really get behind this and start to really understand what it could do for them, and therefore be that support for my managers or leaders about how do I help my team to get more comfortable with it, then that could be really good. I do have a list of resources at the end, which everyone will receive a copy of the deck and the resource pack. And I found a website called Will Robots Take My Job? And you can have a look at the website. I mean, I don't know how widely you'd want to publicise that. Certainly for jobs where, like HR, where you're relying on empathy and judgment and strategic skills, there was quite a low percentage. I certainly put my job in to have a look while I was doing the research for today. But this is something that I think HR, this links with this whole change agent piece. You know, this change is coming. And I think the more that organisations can grasp it, just the psychology of the change, the mindset shift, and then also the actual learning of AI, this is really going to help everyone move forward. And so that is most of what we're going to talk about today. We've had a look through HR through the decades, and we've had a quick look at those key influences as we went through, like the business partnering model, the 3-legged stool, HR technology, and how all of those have influenced HR today. We've had a look at the connection issues around how could the indicators that HR lost its human touch, and those elements like centralisation, like HR automation, physically not being present, and things like that could help. And now what we just looked at are those key areas that in LHH we see that organisations are looking for support from organisations. And again, that will vary depending on the size and the progressiveness of your organisation. but looking at those key themes that HR might want to get involved in. And what I'd like to hear from you now in the chat, and I'll be reading some of these out, we're going to do the Q&A and this call to action. And by call to action, I would like to know, what's resonated with you? Is there anything in your daily HR practice that you think you could change in order to have more human touch? Do you think more human touch is necessary? But I want to thank you all for your comments. It's been really useful, certainly given me some more to think about. As I said, you will receive a copy of the slides in about a week's time. We're going to collate all of those sessions for HR Heroes, this being the first session of a 3-day series of events. I just want to thank you all for participating and taking the time to listen to me today. I hope it's given you some thought too. Do feel free to link in once my details are shared with you. And thanks so much for Rabani for being the technical producer today. So I hope you have a nice rest of the afternoon, and thanks very much for your time.